Welcome back to the third lecture on Act 3, Scene 2. And in this lecture, we're going to look at David and his son Solomon, and then also the key themes that tie all of this act together. So let's talk about David. What we see in this section, predominantly in 2 Samuel, in the book of 2 Samuel, we see it focusing on the rise of David's kingdom. We see, and we're going to talk about in detail here, how 2 Samuel focuses on four big events. And those four events are, David's rise to power, as seen in 2 Samuel chapters 1 through 4. The second is David makes Jerusalem his capital, as recorded in 2 Samuel chapters 5 and 6. In the third one, God makes a covenant with David in 2 Samuel 7 through 10. And then the last of these four foci are David sins and brings disaster upon his house. And we'll see that in 2 Samuel chapters 11 through 24. Now, let's look at this first of four events, and this is David's rise to power, and we see this in 2 Samuel chapters 1 through 4. Now, we're only reading chapters 5 through 8 in 2 Samuel because I know you can't read the whole Bible this semester, especially in the summer semester. So I put you on those certain passages to focus on. But we do need to have a general knowledge of all of this text. So let's look at this first event in 2 Samuel chapter 1 through 4 where David's rise to power. David's already been anointed by God while Saul was still on the throne. And Saul knew of that. And Saul was furious about this situation. And Saul's intent was that he would be the first of a long dynasty in Israel. He would be the great Benjamite king who founded this long dynasty. And he wanted the throne for his son Jonathan and his grandsons and his great-grandsons. He wanted that to continue on. But like we talked about in the last lecture, Saul doesn't have a heart that's in good shape. And he doesn't have a heart for leadership. He doesn't have a heart from the Lord. Saul also becomes jealous of David's relationship with the people. Following David's victory against Goliath in the Valley of Elah, recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 17, David, not too long after that, begins to go out and fight and serves King Saul and fight for him. And David fights against the Philistines, and he's very successful. In fact, David is so successful that the people will make up songs about him and Saul, and they will say, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. So even those songs would have irritated Saul, which we can certainly understand. So as David begins to rise to power, David is consolidating his kingdom, and he is taking care of those who were still loyal to Saul's family. Ishbosheth, who was one of Saul's son, was anointed king after Saul's death by a group of loyalists. Ishbosheth was not able to maintain control, and the group self-destructed, and Ishbosheth ends up dying. But David has been careful to not be directly responsible for the death of any of Saul's family. And he was even careful to punish those who sought his favor by killing those in Saul's household. If you can go back and look in, I think it's at the end of 1 Samuel, you can go back and look, and the guy who comes to tell David that Saul and Jonathan have died, he just found the bodies, but he claims to have actually struck them down himself, and then comes and tells the story to David with great pride that he struck out Saul for King David. David asked him, "Who are you to raise your hand against God's anointed?" And David punishes that. It cost the guy his life. The sad thing is he was lying about it. He didn't even do that. He only found the bodies. If he had told David the truth, David probably would have honored him in some way. But he brags that it was he that struck down Saul and Jonathan. You know, Jonathan and David were close friends. David really demonstrates during this time as he's rising to power, David really demonstrates that his heart is for the Lord. In fact, the biblical text will describe David, even though he's far from perfect, it will describe David as a man after God's own heart. David waits on the Lord, and he obeys him, and he waits until his opportune time arrives. And then he steps forward and becomes king of Israel. The second big event is when David makes Jerusalem his capital. In 2 Samuel, we find this in 2 Samuel chapters 5 and 6. And David is proclaimed king by his people, and he gathers his forces for war, and he marches on Jerusalem, which he marches really on the town of Jebus, which will be renamed Jerusalem. This is a city, this has not been the capital of Israel. And that's been Shechem and Shiloh and those cities in the north. But David marches against the Jebusites. Let's look now at 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 5 and see if we can't look at some of this passage here. 2 Samuel chapter 5. Look here. This is when David is anointed king by all the people. Look here at verse 1. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron, which is down in the south where David has been staying till he waits for the Lord to move him north and establish him as king. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led us out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be the shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. So we see that David gathers his forces for war, and he begins to march on Jerusalem. And that city, like I mentioned, had been, after being anointed at Hebron, then David kicks his machinery into order, and he goes to establish his kingdom at Jebus, soon to be Jerusalem, and he goes to war against the Jebusites. Let's look at that text real quick. It's right after the anointing passage there, and it says here in verse 6 now, 2 Samuel chapter 5, "And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, 'You will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off,' thinking, 'David cannot come in here.' Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. And David said on that day, 'Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul.' Therefore it is said, 'The blind and the lame shall not come into the house of David.' And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around from the Milo inward. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him." This is the word of the Lord. So we see in this passage a nice little play on words. The Jebusites brag, "Our city is so easy to protect. We could put the blind and the lame in charge, and they could keep you from getting in here." Well, David knows that there's a weakness to the city of Jebus, and that is their water. The water source, this only water that Jerusalem has in this day and time, is from the Gihon spring. And this is a spring that comes out of a cave, that's actually at the foot of the hill that the city of Jerusalem is built on at this time. And the Jebusites have built from inside of the wall, they've dug down and dug a path out above the cave and then a shaft down to the spring so they can go in without having to go outside of the city and get into the cave and get the water. So what does David do? He turns to his commander and he tells him, go down into that cave, climb up that shaft, get into the city, and knock the lame and the blind out. And it even continues that kind of play on the words. This is why they say the lame and the blind will not enter into the city of Jerusalem. It says in a latter place in the text. And so the writer had a little bit of a sense of humor. David doesn't really hate the lame and the blind. What he hates is the rebellious Jebusites. And he deals with them very, very well. And this passage is a great example of David's leadership ability. He does an assessment of the problem. He knows what he needs to do, and he gets the job done. After taking control from the Jebusites, it becomes known as the City of David. And David even has the Ark of the Covenant brought to Jerusalem. So that's very shrewd, because what David is doing is David is establishing Jerusalem as the religious and political capital of Israel. And so it is going to be the center. If anybody wants anything done, they've got to come there. Jerusalem's a better choice than, say, Hebron, where David had been reigning from, or better than Shiloh or Shechem or even Bethel. These other places, Shiloh, Shechem, and Bethel, are places that Saul used at various times in his kingdom to reign from. Jerusalem's a better choice because Jerusalem, even though it's located close to the Central Ridge Route, that's the main highway north and south through Israel, it lays just off of that, within eyesight of it. But it's kind of stuck out on a little hill, and it's hard to attack. David's going to fix that problem with the cave entrance down at the bottom of the hill. He's smarter than that. But he's then able to fortify that hill. And the Jebusites were right. It is an easy city to defend if you don't have your backside exposed through the cave. And not only is it a good choice because this is a good, easy to defend, located on the main highway, but also because this is where God leads him to establish his kingdom. We even see one of the neighboring kings, a guy by the name of Hiram of the kingdom of Tyre, who offers to build David a magnificent home. And so that's the second big event, is David making Jerusalem his capital. And then the third thing that we see, the third event that's focused on in 2 Samuel, is God making a covenant with David. God making it, and this is in chapters 7 through 10 of 2 Samuel. Once David is settled into his new palace, he begins to feel bad because God is still living in the tabernacle, a tent. And so David wants to build him a temple. And so he calls the prophet Nathan, who is a good and wise guide for David all of his days. And he tells Nathan what his intentions are. And when Nathan hears what David wants to do, he thinks it's a great idea. He encourages David to do so. But that very night, the Lord spoke to Nathan in Nathan's dreams. And he tells Nathan, I don't want David to build a temple. I don't want him to build a temple. His hands are too bloody, and I don't want my temple to be built by him. We tell him to wait, to prepare, but to wait. Nathan goes back to David and reports to him, and Nathan brings very much good news. No, God does not want you to build the tabernacle, to build the temple, but God does want you to make a covenant with him. God is willing to come into a covenant with you in which God gives you his word that he will take care of the nation of Israel if you will lead them to keep the covenant. And God will give you a son, and that son will be allowed to build the temple. He will be a man of peace. God also promises David that the sons of David and the lineage of David will be forever on the throne. God promises that he will be like a father to David, and David will be like his son, and God will also be like a father to David's sons that follow him. God will always love and keep his commitment to the descendants of David. So David goes out and he prayed to the Lord, and he acknowledges his unworthiness to build the temple, and expresses gratitude to God because God was willing to make a covenant with him in spite of all of his weaknesses and his failings, and for all that God was going to do for him in the future. And then finally, the fourth thing that we see in 2 Samuel, and this is in chapters 11 through 24, and this is where we learn, more things about David, and that is that David sins. The fourth event is that David sins and he brings disaster upon his house. And this is the story that many of us know about David and Bathsheba, and we shouldn't forget about her husband Uriah the Hittite, because he is certainly involved in the story as well. David, now that he has this fancy palace and he's become a proper established king in his capital, he stops going to war with his people. Before, he had always led them in war, but now he stays in Jerusalem and he sends them out. And on one particular occasion when they're sent out, David happens to be on the roof of his palace, or on the top of his palace. Most of these houses were flat roofed. They have very little rain, and so it's not really a water issue for them. And they're also places for them to sleep because it has a nice cool breeze. Sometimes they use them for storage. They use them for all kinds of things. So David's on his roof looking out over the city of Jerusalem, and he notices a woman bathing on her roof. Nothing inappropriate about that. What was inappropriate was David watched her, and he lusted after her, and he finally sent for her and had her brought into his palace. And really, we should not describe this passage at all as if David wooed Bathsheba. What David really did was he raped Bathsheba. He's using his position of authority and power, and she lacks all of that, and he's taking her to his bed and really having his way with her. Then he learns that she's with child, and he wants to hide his sin, and so he sends onto the battlefield and asks for Uriah, her husband, to come home from the battle. Now, David's thought is Uriah will come home from the battle, and we'll give him a few days with his household, and I'll get a little report from him and send him back. But he'll stay at the house, having been to the battlefield a long time. And everybody knows when a man comes back from war like that, and he comes back to his wife, that they're going to engage in some physical activity, and then when she shows up pregnant, no one will know the difference, and everyone will just think that it's Uriah's child because he had come home from battle. But here's where David's plan goes awry. Uriah is a man of integrity, and he respects David. He respects his family, and he respects his fellow soldiers. And just because he's free to come home and be with his family, he left all of his fellow soldiers on the battlefield. And so when Uriah comes home, he doesn't go to his house and take respite. Rather, he sleeps in front of his house. He sleeps outside the door of his house the whole time that he is there. And so it's clear that he doesn't go in and lay with Bathsheba. So now David's problems become more complex. Uriah has more integrity than David ever thought that he would. He never imagined this would happen. And so he hatches another plan, more evil than the first. What he decides to do is he writes a letter to his generals on the battlefield to attack the army, their enemies, harder than they should. And when Uriah and send Uriah to the front of the battle lines, and when Uriah engages on the very front of the battle lines, then they are to withdraw and allow Uriah to be killed by the enemy. To make matters even worse, David writes all this up, rolls it up on a scroll, and puts it in the hands of Uriah to deliver himself to his commander. And this is exactly what takes place. Uriah goes down. He's killed just as David had hoped that he would be. And then after the time of mourning had kind of taken place and it seemed respectable, David acts like he's doing Bathsheba a big favor by bringing her into his household and making her his wife, since she's lost her husband and lost her protection. And it's just horrible. The whole story is corruption, sexual exploitation, abuse of power, and this is King David. Now, David probably would have gotten away with that, but the Lord speaks to Nathan, the prophet that we mentioned earlier, and reveals to Nathan what David has done. And he commissions Nathan to go and confront David over his sin. Now, you have to imagine, being Nathan, that this would be a horrific and very scary thing to have to confront the king over his sin, and basically to call the king a murderer, because indeed he is a murderer. He's a rapist and a murderer. And now Nathan has to tell the king that to his face. Wow, that's a very dangerous proposition. What Nathan does is he goes and tells David, he says, I have something that I want to tell you about some news that I've heard. I've heard that there is a shepherd who just is a poor shepherd, and he just has one ewe lamb, and his whole family is dependent upon that ewe lamb for their livelihood. And so, but there's another shepherd, a neighboring shepherd, who's very wealthy and has many lambs. But that wealthy shepherd likes the poor shepherd's ewe. And so he takes the ewe from him and takes it into his own flock. David, remember, we first meet David as a shepherd. His father Jesse, their whole family depended upon tending the flocks, the sheep and the goats that they cared for. And David becomes enraged that anyone would be so bold, so brazen, so reckless as to treat a fellow citizen in this way. And David tells Nathan, you tell me who that wealthy shepherd is, and I will take care of him. And Nathan looks at him, and he says, David, you're the man. You're the man. And David immediately knows that he's talking about Bathsheba and Uriah. David's response is not anger at Nathan. David's response is repentance, because he knows this conviction has come from the Lord, and he wants to be in a right relationship with the Lord, and he knows he's done wrong, and when he's confronted with this sin, he repents. This is what makes David a man after God's own heart. And this is what can make us people who desire to please God. Not to be perfect, but to work to do our very best, to be ever perfecting. And when we realize our failures, or when someone else points out our failures to it, to be honest and open and lay it before the Lord in confession and ask for forgiveness of our sins and work to make restitution. David was a well-known psalm writer. We'll talk about that in the lecture that's also in this week about Hebrew poetry. And one of his most famous psalms was Psalm, which is number 51. It's Psalm 51, in which David writes this psalm of repentance over his sin with Bathsheba. And it is magnificent. It's a part of our required reading from the biblical text this week. And I know you're going to do all the assigned reading, and I hope that you'll spend some time looking at that psalm, and you really get a picture for what David's heart was really like. But now listen, we learn that David is forgiven for this sin, but this sin has consequences, and the effects of this sin bring a stain upon David's house. And you're going to see before David dies, one of his own daughters raped by one of his own sons. You're going to see one of his sons by the name of Absalom, who rebels against David and tries to take over the kingdom. You're going to see another rebellion by a man by the name of Sheba. And all of this, the biblical text talks about how this is the clear result of David's sin with Bathsheba. I should also add that the child that was conceived from the rape of Bathsheba is born, but it doesn't live. And that's seen as part of kind of the punishment as well. And David mourns for that child and longs to repent, and he does well, and he makes things right with Bathsheba, and ultimately Bathsheba will give birth to Solomon, and Solomon will become the next great king of Israel. The life of David receives a lot of attention in biblical studies because he is the best example of a king that rules well. He is not perfect, but he's repentant. That's another one of the big reasons why David gets a lot of attention. He's not perfect, but he's repentant. And that's that phrase, he's a man after God's own heart. Every king after this in Israel is going to be compared to King David. He becomes the standard by which all the rest are judged. And God makes that covenant with David. Sometimes you'll hear that even referred to as the Davidic covenant, that his son or his descendants will reign forever on that throne. The New Testament proclaims that covenant, that promise that God gave, is fulfilled in the person of Jesus, and how Jesus is born in the lineage of David, of the tribe of Judah, and he is that eternal king that comes to reign and rule forever as a fulfillment of part of that Davidic covenant. We're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 3, 1 Kings chapter 3, and we're going to look at chapter 3, verses 1 through 15. And we're going to read that and talk a little bit about that and some more of chapter 3 as well. Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were sacrificing at the high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. He sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. And the king went out to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I shall give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David, my father. Although I am but a little child, I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding of mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people?" It pleased the Lord that Solomon asked for this. And God said to Solomon, "Because you have asked this, and you have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right. Behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. And Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Then he came to Jerusalem, and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. This is the word of the Lord. So Solomon honors the Lord, and the Lord blesses him with the gift of wisdom, as well as the wealth and honor that he will need to reign. Solomon immediately puts this gift to use. Now, I'm not going to read it at this point because this lecture is starting to get kind of lengthy, but I want to encourage you to maybe pause here and read on in chapter 3 and look at verses 16 through 18. And we will look at one verse, but this is basically a story where two women have a baby. One of the women accidentally rolls over on the baby while she's asleep, and the baby dies, is smothered on accident. She takes her dead baby and goes and while the other woman is asleep with her child who's alive, she takes her dead baby and she puts it on the bed beside the woman asleep and takes the live baby back to her house. Well, then the woman whose baby's been stolen comes before the king and accuses her of what she's done. And both of the women claim that the baby that's alive is theirs. Solomon sits back on his throne and he says, well, I'll tell you what, if we can't get to the bottom of this story, here's how we'll settle it. Bring me a sword and we'll cut this baby in half and we'll give half to each of you and you can go home with it. And immediately the mother whose child it actually was, the one whose baby had been stolen, immediately speaks out and says, no, do not do this. Just let her keep the baby and keep that baby alive. Solomon immediately takes the baby from the woman who had stolen it and gives it to the woman who whose baby had been stolen. And he knows immediately that the mother of the living child would never let her child be killed. And everyone is impressed. That brings us to the verse that I want us to take a quick look at here in chapter 16. We see Solomon's prayer for wisdom. We just read that. Now Solomon's wisdom. Look here at verse 28. And all Israel heard of the judgment the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. And we see that as a narration and as an example of Saul's great wisdom. Now, the other thing that I want us to see is we're kind of, from Moses we get the law, from David, the many of the Psalms are attributed to David. From Solomon, we also get a few Psalms, but what Solomon produces as far as literature goes is Solomon produces wisdom literature. He takes this gift of wisdom that God has given him and he uses it to write and record great things. And so much of the book of Proverbs is attributed to Solomon. All of the book of Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon are attributed to Solomon. And so we see wisdom literature, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, that wisdom literature all attributed to King Solomon and being connected to the united monarchy. Now, Job also belongs in this section called wisdom literature, but Solomon's not a source for that literature. That comes from Job and other directions. Now, Solomon does well. He uses this gift of wisdom, and he leads well and does well. But ultimately, as I mentioned earlier in chapter 11, we see Solomon's tragic end and his failure. And actually, we can see that foreshadowing of his failure all the way back in chapter 3 and verse 1, that passage that we just read, because look what it says. He looked to Pharaoh for a wife, and she came into his house. So he builds an alliance with Egypt, which is one of the great powers in the ancient world. And he even marries this Egyptian woman. And we see his whole kingdom unravel in chapter 11, verses 1 through 13. And this is because he begins to worship other gods, and he allows the worship of other gods. Solomon strays from monotheism. And the basic assumption, the monotheism is the basic assumption of the law and of the Mosaic covenant as a whole, and Solomon therefore is punished. Two great contributions of Solomon, though, that we want to keep in mind, especially in relationship to the religion of Israel. The first is what I just mentioned, the wisdom literature. And in that lecture on Hebrew poetry, I'm going to discuss wisdom literature and talk about the nature of it and how we interpret it a little bit. The other big contribution beyond wisdom literature is the temple. And I want us to talk about that just a little bit. Solomon's temple, which you also see referred to in the biblical text and in biblical literature and in the writings and the readings about it, both by Jews and Christians, you see it referred to as the first temple. The temple is built following the same basic pattern of the tabernacle, but of course it was substantially more elaborate. Basically, the function that the tabernacle had played in the wilderness wanderings, and even up to this point in the history of Israel, is now going to be solidified in the city of Jerusalem in the temple. So it firmly establishes Jerusalem both as the political and religious capital of Israel. Remember, David had brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem to do that. Now, with the building of the temple, Judaism is rooted in the temple, rooted in Jerusalem, to the extent that later when the temple is destroyed, not just the first temple, but then even the second temple is destroyed, Judaism is going to change dramatically, because its theology is no longer defined in relationship to the temple, especially as we see at the end of the first century AD after the destruction of the second temple. In many ways, following the days of Solomon, the temple becomes Judaism. I know that's a bit simplistic, but it's fairly accurate. Religion is now centralized in Jerusalem. Remember, we read earlier on and mentioned earlier on that Solomon would go to Gibeon to make sacrifices, and people could sacrifice at any of the high places. They were appropriate. But once the temple is built, the temple becomes the exclusive place for sacrifice, and all other sacrifice is seen as an abomination. The high places become forbidden, and Solomon's temple and his expansion of the borders of Israel are the height of the united monarchy in Israel. So this kind of concludes the things that I want to talk about Solomon. I do want to back up and talk about some key themes. We've looked at key figures here. Obviously, God, a central figure throughout the biblical text. We always are talking about the interplay and the working and the relationship with God. But we've also talked about Joshua. We've talked about the judges in general, Othniel and Samuel, the last judge, in detail. But we talked about the judges. Then we focused in on Samuel and Saul and David and now Solomon. So let's talk a little bit about this Act 3, Scene 2 kind of key themes. One of the things that we're going to see, especially since this is called a land for the kingdom or a land for the people, we're going to see a strong connection in which God is keeping the covenant by giving the people the land that he promised. God is faithful and he keeps the commandment. In Joshua and Judges, we see God delivering on his promise to give the people the land and the people to be put into the land. We also see in Joshua Judges the importance of obedience. We also see the importance of obedience. This is in relationship to the covenant, but it also has an effect on their possession of the land. We see the importance of obedience. The book of Judges especially illustrates the failure of the people to keep the covenant. They lose land, get land back based on their obedience. A second kind of theme that we see here, key theme, is corporate solidarity. And that's the idea that we all succeed together or we all fail together. So it's never enough to say, well, we're doing what the Lord says, and so we should be successful. No, we're in this together. The people of Israel learned that they're going to succeed as a people or they're going to fail as a people based on their faithfulness and their loyalty to each other. We also, another theme that we see here, and I talked about it and emphasized it in earlier on in another video, that the Spirit of the Lord, especially as it's seen in Joshua and in the book of Judges, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon the people for them to fulfill the task that God has called them to do. But the Spirit of the Lord is not in one place and doesn't continue to indwell all of the faithful to the covenant. It's just there for a time and then gone. Now, in the United Monarchy, after this Joshua Judges, which we also will refer to as conquest settlement period, conquest of the land and settlement of the land. But then in the United Monarchy, as the kingdom comes together, and there's one king and one people, we see God continuing to make covenant with his people, just as he had made a covenant with Adam and with Noah and with Moses and with Joshua. And now we see God making a covenant with David and establishing David's line as kind of an eternal kingship. And we see in all of these covenants, or in this kind of corporate idea of covenant for the whole nation, we see that there continues to be blessings and curses for keeping the covenant or abandoning the covenant. So now we've worked on a big chunk of Act 3, Scene 2, and we've covered a lot of biblical text. I've tried to give you a quick but good influence. Make sure you're reading the textbook and the biblical passages assigned, because you'll need information from all of those sources to do well in the quiz. Remember, quizzes are due on Fridays by 11 p.m. and then on our objective exam and on the essay exam, which will be due here. The first essay exam and first objective exam will cover the first 2 weeks, the first kind of 2 units, and those are all due on Sunday by 11 p.m. And then the next week, kind of the third unit, if you will, we'll have its own exam. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and email me if you have questions. May the peace of Christ be with you all.